Hello there.
Belated sequels to hit films can be a bit of a mixed bag. They're either a total game changer that reinvigorates the love for the franchise, or a total dud that will make you question why they bothered to make a sequel at all. So overall, what are some of the best examples of sequels that were worth the long wait? Or on the other hand, what were the examples of sequels that just came way too late? Well, that's what today's video is all about. So sit back and get into full-on sequel mode, because we're diving into the sequels that had the longest wait from the previous installments, and talking about if the wait was a good or bad thing. Ready? Let's get into it right now.
Now let's get some distance before that thing goes supernova. How do you pronounce supernova?
Oh, what a day, what a lovely day it is to be talking about Mad Max Fury Road. The film is a very loose sequel to the classic 70s and 80s Mad Max franchise. Now, the big question, was the sequel worth the wait? Let me put it this way, watching that movie is like being carried through the gates of Valhalla, and I would say that's the pretty standard consensus. Although the box office wasn't huge for the film, netting less than $400 million worldwide, it was a critical darling, earning a 97% on Rotten Tomatoes and garnering 10 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture and Best Director. Even though it's not Mel Gibson in the role as Mad Max, but rather Tom Hardy, it's still George Miller behind the wheel of the movie, and the final product just radiates creativity, style, and flair. And the fact is, Miller wisely made Max a more supporting character in the movie, ceding the spotlight to Charlize Theron's Furiosa, who was a true standout and was such a fan favorite that she's getting her own prequel spin-off in the near future. So I guess one way to make a sequel to a movie that happened close to 30 years earlier would be to make sure you have the same mind behind the project and not be afraid to focus on other characters. Jurassic World had probably the best hook for any sequel on this list. What if they actually opened Jurassic Park?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
With that simple yet brilliant premise, along with a stellar marketing campaign, Jurassic World opened up to massive numbers. Everyone knew it was going to be a hit, but no one could predict just how monstrous the final box office was going to be. Its opening weekend smashed all sorts of records, becoming the first film ever to collect over $500 million in a single weekend, and quickly became the third highest grossing film of all time. Sure, it wouldn't stay there for long thanks to another huge movie released in 2015 that we'll get to soon, but overall, that's insanely impressive, especially because interest in the franchise seemed to have gone extinct 14 years earlier with the release of Jurassic Park 3, which, while a commercial success, wasn't as fondly received as the previous two movies. Can you say dream sequence talking raptor, anyone? But was this sequel, Jurassic World, worth the wait? I say absolutely. In fact, the long wait between the third and fourth installment I think really benefited the movie overall, as it allowed audiences to truly miss all the dino carnage, and it allowed for them to make a sequel with a believable, intriguing new premise, with the third film in the Jurassic World series scheduled for 2022. Toy Story 3 was another sequel that was definitely worth the wait. Toy Story 2 came out in 1999 and was centered around the idea of what happens to toys when their kids grow up. In the end of that movie, it saw Woody reject the chance to be put on display in Japan just so he could have a few more years with Andy and watch him grow up. So what happened next? Well, 11 years later, Toy Story 3 came out and we got to see exactly the future Toy Story 2 predicted as Andy prepared to go off to college. What would become of these toys now? The Toy Story films had always been critical successes, but the third film really was a game changer for the franchise. Not only did it win the Best Animated Feature Oscar because, duh, it was a Pixar movie, but it was also nominated for Best Adapted Screenplay and Best Picture. And anyone who's seen the movie will say that it was well deserved. Toy Story 3 told a very emotional story about growing up and aging that fans who literally were kids when the first Toy Story was released and were now adults could really relate to. Plus, that ending where... Okay, I can do this. That ending in the furnace where they all hold hands because they know they're about to meet their doom? Oh man, I'm sorry, I need a moment. Not all sequels are worth the wait though. Sometimes a tremendously hyped up sequel fails to capture the magic of the original. That was the case with Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, which came out nearly 20 years after Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Now, I think it's safe to say that Indiana Jones is one of the most iconic pop culture creations of all time. The charm, the hat, the whip. So you would think Harrison Ford returning to one of his most iconic roles under the direction of Steven Spielberg with a story by George Lucas Lucas and written by David Koepp would be an automatic slam dunk, right? Well, not so much. While it does have its moments, this movie really nuked the fridge, if you know what I mean. And I can say that about the movie because that expression literally comes from this movie. It's like a modern day update for Jumping the Shark. And when your movie starts off that ridiculous, it's hard to recover. And speaking of gaps between sequels, they're still working on Indiana Jones 5, which should come out anytime between now and 2030 and see Indiana Jones search for buried treasure in his local retirement home. Alright, this next one is a little tricky to place. Technically, the gap between Star Wars films is only 10 years, with The Force Awakens coming out 10 years after Revenge of the Sith. But really, The Force Awakens is a sequel to Return of the Jedi, which came out 32 years earlier. And yeah, while the prequel movies are mostly just okay and gave fans the chance to learn the backstory of how Anakin became Darth Vader and got to see how awesome Obi-Wan was in his younger years, The Force Awakens got to continue the story from where we left off originally. And overall, it was definitely worth the wait. Although the general consensus is that The Force Awakens tends to veer a little too close to A New Hope in terms of story and structure, it was still a perfect jumpstart for this new trilogy, and both introduced us to some compelling new characters while spending just enough time with the OGs. It was a pretty effective pass-the-torch movie that laid the foundation for future movies. But now let's avoid fighting about The Last Jedi in the comments, okay? What's that? Oh, it's too late? Oh well. Ridley Scott's Blade Runner was released back in 1982 and is regarded as one of the most influential science fiction movies of all time. And although Scott didn't return as director for the highly anticipated sequel, which, given Scott's insane work ethic even today, wouldn't have been out of the question, the franchise was placed in the very capable hands of Denis Villeneuve, who's quickly proving himself to be one of the best directors working today. Harrison Ford returns as Rick Deckard, and man, what was it about Harrison Ford and returning to all of his iconic roles? Anyway, Deckard is more of a supporting role in the film, with Ryan Gosling taking the lead as K, a replicant Blade Runner who starts questioning the world around him. Was it worth the wait? Yes, the long gap between movies really helped in seeing how different the world had become since the first Blade Runner. And although the film still didn't definitively answer the age-old question of whether Deckard was actually a replicant or not, it still was a gripping drama that was just gorgeous to look at. Sure, even though it was close to 3 hours long and the box office wasn't that big considering its huge budget, the film was a major critical success, earning 5 Academy Award nominations and winning 2 of them. Best Visual Effects, because duh, and Best Cinematography, also because duh. Admittedly, comedy sequels are the hardest types of sequels to do. If you have a super successful comedy, there's always an urge to make another one. But they're difficult to approach. You can either give audiences different versions of the same jokes because you know they worked the first time, but run the risk of diminishing returns since the original jokes were probably better, or you can go in a different direction than the first film, but then take the chance of losing what made the first comedy special in the first place.
And I stand by my performance.
On rare occasions, comedy sequels can work. But other times you get things like Dumb and Dumber 2, the sequel to one of the most popular comedies of all time, which came out close to 20 years after the original. Yes, it gave us a Jim Carrey and Jeff Daniels reunion, but critics were not impressed by their reunion. With only a 30% on Rotten Tomatoes and a less than stellar box office, it's clear this was a sequel that didn't necessarily need to happen.
Probably.
Now, if you'll excuse me, I might just go watch the original again, because I want to hear what the most annoying sound in the world is. The really beautiful thing about Tron Legacy is that you didn't have to be super knowledgeable about the first movie to understand the sequel. Although it continued a few plot threads from the original movie that was released in 1982, the 2010 sequel did a good job in making the Tron world accessible to new audience members, who probably never saw the first one. Was it worth the wait though? I'll answer that with a resounding maybe. It did relatively okay at the box office, making solid but not groundbreaking numbers, and was met with a middle-of-the-road critical reaction. A sequel was planned in 2010 but never materialized. But 2020 just brought news that a third film starring Jared Leto is now officially in development, so we'll see what happens. If there was one Pixar movie that deserved a sequel, it was The Incredibles. Released in 2004, the animated superhero family film still remains a favorite today, and ever since then, fans had been dying to see a sequel. Well, 14 years later, we finally got one. And here's the real beauty of an animated sequel. Even though it was a long gap between movies, the sequel basically picked up right where the last one left off, with the Parr family finishing their fight with the Underminer. and then embarking on a whole new adventure. The sequel was almost as well received as the first one, making it worth the wait. So now do we have to wait another 14 years to see Jack Jack Turn 2? Mary Poppins Returns holds the record for the longest sequel gap for live-action movies, with the second film releasing a whopping 54 years after the original. The first film is a classic that scored 13 Academy Award nominations and 5 wins, so it would be hard for any sequel to successfully top that. But overall, Mary Poppins Returns was a moderate success, earning 4 Academy Award nominations and a $350 million box office gross. Was it worth the wait? Yes and no. Although Julie Andrews didn't return for the sequel, we did get to see a 91-year-old Dick Van Dyke dance on a table in the film, which definitely made it worth waiting so long for the sequel. What sequels do you think were worth the wait? Which ones do you think should have never come out at all? Is there a sequel we didn't talk about? Let us know all that below in the comments, and while you're there, be sure to hit that big like and subscribe button for more awesome content like this. Thanks for watching Screen Rant. See you next time.